Luke and I recorded a podcast last week about elite athletes and doping. And one of the most interesting comments that came from that podcast, we had many comments from off the back of that, was from Coach Selva Yoga, who's joining me on the podcast today. Firstly, welcome.
Thanks for that. Thanks, Matt, for having me on. Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here, so yeah, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you. I'll read out your comment and we'll sort of take it from there. So you commented on our Spotify channel and you said high performance coach here. And I'd love to dive into, what you do shortly as well. But you said, I've coached a dozen 214 down to 207 marathons from Kenya and Ethiopia athletes. You guys are very wrong about the Africans, but correct about Haynes. Some Africans dope because of the money to win races, etc. However, there are clubs that are against doping because they're not money orientated. Check out Brother Colm's group. They don't dope. He doesn't allow it. If there isn't money involved and you have good coaching and good people around you, the athletes won't dope. Where do you want to start with this? It's a lot. There's a lot of different
Love it.
directions we can take, but I'll let you decide.
I love it. Yeah, I think this is gonna turn into some very interesting conversations. I think there's a lot to break down here in terms of doping, and there's so much corruption that's happening outside of doping. But what I'll do, I think I'll break down how I got into all this, like how I got into the coaching aspects, so everyone can understand a little bit about myself and about the team and the athletes that I coach. So, I've been coaching for a very long time, since 2010. I was a cross-country athlete, of course, and launched my team, Northern Endurance Project, in 2020. I was coaching college as well at that time. I learned from high-profile coaches, so I learned the morality side of it. Don't do doping, don't do so all these things that come with morality, right? Outside of that, that's like the very basic of it. I also learned from the athletes, so Kenyans, Ethiopians, Americans, Canadians, Europeans. I think you can learn from the athletes as well there, at all levels, from beginner to elite levels. And PBs from 225 all the way to 207. Some of these athletes have run, and for women, to 252 to down to 238. The focus has been on long-term development, not just about winning races. We throw that conversation out the window. We're just like, hey, one step at a time, let's see what you can do. And long-term development is a goal. So what we're trying to build in Toronto is, we're trying to take away all that ego, all that money, and all that, need for success. And we're trying to just build a team in Canada and keep athletes here domestically, rather than sending them off to the D1 program, where there's a conveyor belt of athletes that come in and out of that program. And, some of them can make it out really well, and some of them, break down and you never hear from them again. So we're trying to change that and keep our athletes here. And over the time, we've had some interesting conversations with, Canadian athletes, American athletes, but also a lot of Kenyan and Ethiopian athletes. And this is where I think, I have that insight on, the doping and the environments, etc. And yeah, I'll get into that right now. So I think with doping, there are several ways, doping athletes, when they're caught doping, either caught in competition, out of competition, or suspensions, right, for missing 3 tests in 12 months. Or when your blood amounts are higher than normal. Those are the ways that, athletes are caught doping. And unfortunately, it's not fair for everybody, because certain athletes will get tested more than other athletes. And this is where we're going to talk about what actually happens in Ethiopia and Kenya and the environments. And so there are great coaches out there, really, really great coaches. And I'm sure, Matt, you've ran with one of those coaches, with Brother Colm in St. Patrick's High School, right? There are other coaches as well. And we'll get into those other coaches later on, because I want to show that there is good stuff happening in Kenya, but there's also some really, really bad stuff happening in Kenya. And it's important to, talk about that. The corruption in Kenya, the Kenyan Anti-Doping Agency, the Federation, Athletic Kenya Federation. There are a lot of problems at the highest level there. There's a lot of financial problems. There's a lot of bribery. There's a lot of issues, with clubs, personally prescribing medication that they shouldn't for athletes, right? Doctors, that are making up medical claims so that their athletes can race. That is one of the biggest problems I've heard of so far. And the Kenyan Anti-Doping Agency, CADA, they work with big managers, right? And they have gone as far as collaborating with these big managers and Athletics Kenya to cover up certain things when it comes to athletes and doping. Now, it can get as far as changing urine samples, or it can get as far as hiding or letting people know when they're coming to get tested. Those are some of the claims from multiple sources that I've heard. And there also is a lot of evidence for this as well, but I don't can't bring it up in this podcast. And this might be another conversation for another day where we can talk about that and have another podcast for like maybe showing the evidence of all this. But there's also other issues. There's big managers, you heard the names of Federico Rosa, guys like that who have caused a lot of problems. And I'll get into some of the problems with him as well. And age cheating, right? So changing identifications. And there's one of the biggest issues is sexual harassment with younger athletes. And tribalism. So tribalism is something where one specific tribe in Kenya is preferred for athletic competition. And that is I'll get into the specifics of that tribe and how the politics works in there, but it can get pretty crazy when we start getting into this. And then I'll talk about, why this is happening in Kenya, why it's not happening as much in Ethiopia, and we'll get into the details.
Very interesting. Wow, I've got about 10 different bullet points here as to where to go next. Um, I've got a question straight off the bat because you mentioned this is a direct comment about someone that people will find interesting before we dive into the Kenya Anti-Doping Agency, tribalism, all these, sexual harassment topics. Yeah, that'll be interesting to talk about. But you mentioned in your comment that Brother Colm's group don't dope. Now, the 10K world record holder, Ronix Kipruto, is currently banned. Do you know what happened there? He
So
trains
that
with Brother
specific
Colm.
case,
Yeah.
yes. So I've heard of this. That specific case, I don't know. None of my athletes have talked about that. We've asked around. There is because Brother Colm is not a manager,
No, I
right?
know. Yeah.
He's not going to races. He lets his athletes do his own thing, do their own thing. When you get involved with I'm going to use this word very carefully here because it is going to be viewed by a lot of people here, but mafias, right? Mafias are involved in the sport of running in Kenya and Ethiopia. They're mostly coming from Europe, and there's a lot of money being exchanged. And when athletes are winning and taking spots of their favorite athletes, it can either happen that they're falsifying urine samples to put them under, or they're giving them drugs to get them on their side. And once you have an athlete that's already doing drugs with you, they're not going to leave your management because they have the evidence they can use against you. So we're talking about like an Epstein level of a scandal here that no one's really gotten into because everyone's afraid, right? There's this fear in Kenya, especially with the female athletes. Once you're in the system, once you're with a manager like Federico, there's no getting out of it, right? They will come to your door. They will either beat you up. Sometimes, you will die. There are cases where athletes have died. And there is no solution in Kenya from Athletics Kenya, as far as I know, for solving these problems. So Brother Colm, I'm not surprised that something did this happen. He was trying to keep a lot of this out of his group. But sooner or later, something is going to come inside of that group, right? Someone from peers is going to give you drugs, or the drug situation in Kenya is everywhere. It's around. You can get them at grocery stores. Sorry, not grocery stores. You can get them at pharmaceutical stores, right? And when you have more drugs, it's more rampant. All you need to do is try it once, right? Sort of how kids here, we try weed, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or I'm sure people out here have tried cocaine as well. Once you're hooked on something, it's not really the need to try it again. It's not an addiction, like a physical addiction, but it's more like you see a performance addiction, right? And that's kind of some of the problems that are happening over there. Is they'll get you hooked on it. They'll get you hooked on running fast, and then they'll give it to you again. And when you don't get it, that's where the problems come, right? You might have someone come to your door and be like, "Hey, we want the money from your winnings," right? So there's a lot of suspicious things that are happening. There's a lot of topics to cover in that area, but I do want to also talk about some of the evidence-based stuff that I heard from our athletes as well.
Very interesting. I also witnessed a bit of that. So I've been to Kenya 7 times. I did hear little stories that align with what you just said around people turning up at doors. I didn't see anything, but I did hear things. Yeah, you make a good point. So for people that listening that don't know who Brother Colm is, because I have to think when I make content, a lot of people uh, that listen to the podcast started running in 2020 or after. And Brother Colm was much more well known before that time because Brother Colm is an Irish coach. He still is a priest, I believe you would sort of label him. And he went to Kenya in the 80s and picked up running coaching just off the back of there not being a running coach in Iten at the time at the high school. And he over many, many years and over decades, coached some of the world's best Kenyan distance runners, including probably most famously coached David Rudisha, who now holds the world record for the 800 meters and won the London and Rio Olympic Games. He was a big inspiration for me because I was racing the 800 meters at the same time, and I raced against Rudisha when he came to Australia a couple of times. I was a long way behind him. But we're talking about the coach of one of the best distance runners of all time. And Ronix Kipruto, who currently has the 10K world record on the road, does train with that group. Now, Brother Colm's group, I don't believe have had any other positive tests. So what might have happened there is Ronix is, like you mentioned, he may have been swayed by a manager. He may have had something else happen. Because when I met Ronix, it's almost silly to say this, he did seem certainly like a complete open book when I was training with them. He was welcoming him to his home, and that doesn't mean everything, but it's worth noting he definitely didn't seem at the time when I met him in 2016 and again in 2018 that he had anything to hide, but that doesn't really mean all that much. Yeah, where do you want to go next with this? I mean, the tribalism thing is interesting, the sexual harassment thing
Oh,
is interesting, and also the drugs and what you can buy
yeah,
at the pharmacy stores. I mean, I've seen that as well. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, Matt, I'm just getting started here. I'm going to get into, I think, let's start with Federico because all this information is out there. You could go simple Google search on Federico and find out certain things, right? You've We've all heard that Federico's involved with, uh, he's a manager. He's not exactly a coach, but he has coaches under him, right? And most recent, was the Rita Captu, of who won Boston, Paris, and Chicago. That was one of the bigger cases. As well, Kiprop, the 1500-meter Olympic champion, and the very most recent was Ruth Chetmich, right? 209 in the marathon. A lot of us saw that coming. A lot of us were like, oh, 209 is really fast. That's not why I saw it coming. Like I personally saw it coming because I knew she was associated with Federico. I don't like to jump to the conclusions that someone's fast and they're like doping all of a sudden, right? I know a lot of people do that, but I'm more like, who are you associated with? What are your connections? Well, who's your manager? I think that for me is like the biggest telling sign of someone's doping. Federico, he's known for having doctors that hide certain things, and he knows how to, he has the science of all this stuff figured out. Especially Dr. Mueller. Um, there's a large contingent of athletes that he's working with that say they're sick, right? And then they'll get certain drugs to help them use that. So technically, it is legal under WADA for them to be taking these drugs, but it's also legal because they're falsifying medical records, right? And once you're an athlete at Federico, you can't leave because they have all this evidence of you on you. They know that you falsified your medical records, all that stuff. They know that you are taking banned substances. So it's almost impossible for you to turn on it, right? Federico is also involved. He's one of the bigger managers, also involved in age cheating. So, changing identifications for world under U20 championships.
This happens a lot in Kenya
I hate.
and Ethiopia. Yeah.
Yeah, it's everywhere. This is not just Frederick. This is like literally almost everybody, and mostly it's out of the city. But there are some cases like in the city as well. You just can't avoid it. And Athletics Kenya's solution for this was to require to submit a passport, right? So like you'd show a passport and then you submit it for world championships, and then also like for the world U20 championships administration team, that's what they were doing. The problem is all these documents are falsified, right? So they just take a photo and then falsify the document, send it over. There's no way of verifying it, especially if you have to run it through, the Kenyan Federation as well, right? I really hate this, and like it's taking opportunities away from the young athletes,
Mm.
athletes that have the potential to compete and like possibly put themselves out there, but then you're racing against a 25-year-old, right? And it just makes no sense to me that they still haven't found a solution for this, to be honest. And that's a big problem. And the irony about this is you can't change your age later, right? So a lot of Kenyan athletes that are in their 40s, on paper, they're in their 30s or maybe even 20s, they can't compete for world master championships, right? Or they can't do these crazy master times. because they're really fit. It's just because their times are wrong, right? So we have all these problems, and there's no real solution to solve them. And then I'm also going to get into sexual harassment because I think this is one of the bigger problems here. Um, I have personally been in contact with athletes that I coach both here and in Kenya. Um, I'm going to be very, very careful here because these are some very powerful people that we're talking about. So I'm not going to, I'm not going to say my athletes' names, but I am going to go down swinging on some of these managers because I think the world needs to know about these people and what they're capable of. So one of them is Enrico Dioncini. He's the manager. He's one of the biggest managers in Italy. Um, and this guy is an absolutely despicable human being, right? He is like the Epstein level. He's pretty much the Epstein of the running world. Um, he would ask, his athletes. He's a manager. He would ask his athletes to come to his office at night, right? And he would not change their plane tickets. He would ask them to come to his office at night so he can change their plane tickets, etc. And then he would take advantage of female athletes, U20 athletes, right? Some of them even younger than that. Um, and he had a bed in his office. This is how crazy he gets, right? Um, and girls will come in his office. They'll see him with his boxers on, and then he would pay them 50 euros per night. And if you refuse, you get kicked out of the club, right? Or you get killed,
He'd
right?
pay them.
Or athletics, yeah,
Huh.
yeah. This is crazy. This is firsthand um, notes from athletes that I've personally talked to and collaborating stories. So this is for sure happening. Where there's smoke, there's fire. In this case, there's fire. Like there isn't just smoke we're talking about with this guy. He is absolutely horrible. Um, there's another guy, his name is Francis Kamau. They call him the master. You know, it's not really a good nickname to have. I don't think so. But he's known for also the same thing. U20 athletes. When you refuse, he chases you away from the camp, right? One of my athletes, he approached her and wanted her to come to the camp to train, and she was like, "Sure, I'll come." And then she talked to some of the ladies there, and the ladies told her not to come. And at first, she was like, "Oh, are they being jealous?" and etc. And they were like, "No." Every single one of those ladies said he tries to have sex with you, and if you don't, then you get in trouble, essentially. So that was, Francis Kamau, Enrico Dioncini. These are the ones that we just know about, right? We don't know how many of these managers are really out there, how many of these coaches. There was a guy named Taki Kumari. This is very interesting. I don't know if you heard of this. He recently won a doping case. So Federico Rosa, he was involved with two managers, right? Enrico Dioncini, Federico Rosa. The mafias falsified his samples, and they bribed ADAC essentially to get him to test positive for the results. And you can look at this and feel like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, right? But then when you see the news articles of him proving his case and winning, it makes you think more about, are all these rumors true, right? And I am not surprised by this as well. And then I was just, I had this confirmed by one of my athletes as well, like who knew Taki, right? Um, he never even trained in 10, right? The samples were taken in the 10, right? So how does an athlete get caught in a 10 when he's not even living and training in a 10? So someone purposely, falsified his urine samples. And that's because a lot of powerful mafias are at play. And he won his case. So the good news is, if you are in a situation like that, there is a possibility that you can win your case. But how many of these cases have gone, under the radar? And how many of them, because they'll give you your own lawyers, right? So like Federico Rosa and Dioncini, they'll provide you with these lawyers. And the lawyer's going to keep tabs on you, right? So you don't say certain things. So unless you have your own lawyer, you're kind of at the will of the lawyers that are provided to you. And a lot of these athletes don't have the money. And a lot of these athletes don't have, the education because they've been training their whole lives to know how to fight these people in court or what to bring up and what their rights are, really, right? So they don't know. So Tataki's case is very interesting because the federation also came after him. So I'm talking about Athletics Kenya. He had to get out of there. He moved to the States. Essentially, the reason they came after him was because he won the Kenyan trials, and he wanted to race for two of the trials. And they asked him to withdraw from the race, and he was like, "No, I want to race in both of these." And Federico was like, I want um, I want one of my athletes to do it." And he was like, "No." And that was their way of saying, "Hey, like we can do whatever we want." Um, and so, the federation, if you go against, see, the federation most of the time is on your side, but there is some corruption there, and um, essentially, if you don't keep some of these things to yourselves, you're in trouble. They'll come after you, um, and a lot of athletes don't know their rights. They don't know which managers have been banned. They don't know, and it gets crazier than this, right? When you're participating in a race and you've won a race, right? Sometimes these athletes don't get paid because the managers are the ones that are controlling the money. They get offered the housing, and they say in the contract that, hey, this hotel that you're staying at will be covered, right? But it's not. So they're charging for the hotel, which is going to be like $300 to $800 USD, and then they'll take that out of the cut, right? And then they'll take other expenses out of the cut until you're pretty much left with nothing. So there's a lot of scamming like that's going on top of all this, and it's a very very scary topic. And I think the world does need to hear about them. I'm surprised there's not a lot more that's been said about this.
Wow. Yeah, it's funny because I'm sort of repeating myself a bit, but when I was in Kenya, I just sort of heard sort of whispers about this sort of thing, mafias, and I've never been fully clear on where Kenyan Athletics Federation fits into the whole. Are they assisting with anything? Are they fully sitting back and just sort of like letting it happen? Are they trying to prevent it? Like, where do you think they sit, Kenya Athletics Federation?
So that's a great question. I think because of public pressure, they're being forced to increase their testing. They've launched CATA, Kenyan Anti-Doping Agency. So they're testing all over, the Kenyan cross country championships. That's why the case of positive results are going up. But I think their solution right now is literally just sit back, test at the major competitions. Certain clubs, they say that they're testing at, but they're also getting paid, right? They're getting paid by certain interests, certain corporations, certain managers, certain mafias, and they're telling these athletes and clubs ahead of time when they're going to come, right? So so if you know that you're going to go to this area of Kenya, Eldoret or 10, and in advance when they're going to be there, they'll just drink a bunch of water and then dilute their sample, right? This is the kind of stuff that happens, and it gives them a huge advantage, right? Because they can take as much drugs as they want. They won't get tested in competition. And what you'll find out if you look into this a little bit, online, Matt, most of the positive tests happen outside of Kenya for the high profile cases, right? The middle tier cases where this athletes just like running, like for men, like say they're running like 205 to 210, those cases happen in Kenya. But the athletes that are running 203, 202, 201, and for women's like under 220, those cases are happening outside of Kenya, because they have less control. The mafias have less control in these races. The testing is not up to them. It's up to the country's anti-doping agency, right?
Mm. Yeah, so we've touched on a couple of those key points. I want to name a few names, big names, and for you to let me know anything that you know about them. Kelvin Kiptum, I guess we can probably speak somewhat freely about him, given that he's no longer with us, but he is the world record holder
Yep.
for the men's marathon. 2 hours and 35 seconds, I believe it is. A lot of people are suspicious of his results because he sort of ran fair few half marathons in 58 minutes, 59 minutes, and then started his marathon career with a 2:01 and then got down to 2:00:35 and made it look pretty easy. Do you know anything more about Kelvin Kiptum and anything suspicious going on there?
Yeah, so this is what I've heard. I also gonna be very careful here because, rest in peace to Calvin Pipton. He did
Mm,
change the sport of running for us and what's possible. Um, I'm not gonna say that he was doping. What I will say is he was involved with some very sketchy people. Um, there was Chinese brands that he was working with,
mm.
right?
Lening, right?
We all know about that. Sorry?
Lening.
Yeah, yeah. So they're the Chinese that showed up to his house. Um, but there were a lot of other sketchy things. He died while he was driving a car, and he had a heart attack and all those things. But from what I've heard, he wasn't associated with Federico. This is what like some of my athletes that have been telling me. So he's not a part of that syndicate, but that doesn't mean that he wasn't a part of another syndicate, right? So it doesn't necessarily clear him of anything, but one can look at the times and come to their own conclusions. I have my own opinions on. I can look at his times and look at his progression and kind of come to this conclusion of what I think it is. I'm not going to say that here because he's not with us anymore, and I want to respect that. And I don't know. I can't say with 100% certainty that he is not clean.
Mm. I don't think that surprises too many people. I did meet him and his coach, not a brag, just a fact, at a KFC 3 weeks before he broke the world record in Chicago in 2023. No reason for the KFC. It was just a landmark that was simple to agree on. And it's funny because people will meet people and speak to them for a while and say, "Oh, they're not doping. They're such a nice person." But you can't think like that. It's even if someone's welcoming you into their home, there's still other places they can go to facilitate, right? Eliud Kipchoge and the NN running team who have just been purchased by some other company. Do you know anything more about them? I guess you probably have to be a little bit careful with this because they're all around the world, and yeah, and feel free to pass, by the way, on any of these things.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I'll tell you my opinion. I think with Elliot, you know, I think at a young age there might have been something involved there. I think as he got older and he started to see success, I think a lot of those drugs were removed because of what the brand involvement with Nike is. This the chance of getting caught versus you know the, the value that he brings to the brand of Nike and all the sponsors. It just doesn't make sense for him to be doing it. I haven't heard personally anything from any of the running team on my end in terms of anything that they're doing now in the last 5 years. But there was a lot of, sketchy stuff that was happening a while ago. Right. And I think they're being extra careful with everything that's happening. They're trying to stay like under the radar. So I think for their top athletes, they're very, very careful with the drug situation. I don't think they want to risk it. There's too much brand money involved. And Elliot's already done what he's done. There's no point of him taking drugs at this point or anyone else. They have the brand there and they've already created it. But that's not saying, he never did it at one point, right?
Mm.
Some of his times are very, very impressive, and that's not enough evidence to say, he did it. I don't have anyone specifically that said anything about Elliot, but um, I would look at the companies, right? Anytime there's money involved, anytime there's financial incentive, I think some sketchy stuff gets involved. Like, we see it, in government, right?
Oh
Like
yeah.
look at the United States, for example, right? So corruption happens everywhere, and you can't avoid that, unfortunately.
Kipchoge has had a few people in his training group test positive, um, that are not as fast as him. Quite a few actually. So yeah, it's interesting. I've never heard any clear stories, but I have heard similar things to what you're saying. Chetan Gedich, women's world record holder. She was tested positive 6 months maybe after she broke the world record. Um, do you know anything more about her training group and who she's associated with, or any more comments?
Yeah. There is, Ruth, there are people that she trains with. Um, Without saying the person's name, I'm going to say this other person is a world record holder as well. Um, Anytime you're associated with someone like Federico, I would say you're probably doping, right? And people can look up and kind of figure out who it is I'm talking about. But I'm not going to say the names of these athletes just because, again, just be they're again, they probably are doing it, right? But I personally haven't heard from anything about them from my end, right? So I'm going to keep their names out. But one of them is a world record holder, and sooner or later, this person is going to get caught at one point. So we'll hear about it in the news, I think, at one point.
Only
And that's
Ethiopian
thinking these
athletes.
fuels.
Only Ethiopian athletes are coming to my mind. No Kenyans are jumping into my mind.
There's a Kenyan in there. You'll find out. What's going to happen, Matt? Matt's going to go on his laptop later tonight. He's going to Google Kenyan athlete world record holders, and it's going to click to him.
Give us the event.
Oh, that's giving it away. That's that. Yeah, that's an easy Google search right there.
Okay. I'm aware that there's legal
But yeah, I mean, it's
consequences
not
for this
just
stuff. Yeah.
yeah, and this is why I'm being careful, right? Because
You have to be careful.
Federico, yeah, because Federico, he's mafia, right? And I'm gonna use that term very loosely because what is a mafia? The definition of mafia is someone that is in control of a certain group of people, tells them what to do, has financial incentive, illegal activities that are happening within that group, and there's bribery happening at the state level, sorry, city level and country level, right? Um, he definitely falls into that category. He has gotten away with so much, but he's also been this close, right? Sooner or later, he's going to come down, right? Like a lot of these guys, sooner or later, they will come down, I think.
How do you think they'll quote unquote come down?
Just the same way, Matt,
Salazar style or
well, there's evidence of this, right? And this is one of those things I couldn't put on this podcast because the athletes in question were not comfortable with me providing the evidence here because they have family back home in Kenya, right? And so if I were to share that evidence, they would do their research and they would know who this person is. And I can't provide evidence to you right now, but I think in the next 3 to 5 years, some of this evidence might come out and he's going to come down, not just from athletes that I've talked to, but other athletes. And I think the reason it's going to come out is a lot of these athletes, they are getting the guts to run away from him and move to another country and kind of get away from that situation.
mm.
Um, and when you have athletes moving to another country, they feel more safe. They feel like Federico can't touch them there in the United States or Canada or Europe he's kind of there everywhere in Europe, but outside of Europe, he doesn't have that reach, other than Kenya and Ethiopia. So I think certain names are going to come out, and I think witnesses are going to come forward, and I think recordings are going to be released, and I think videos are going to be out there. And I'm not just talking about doping; I'm talking about things that make doping seem, elementary.
Mm. I think I know who you were talking about before, by the way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, Matt's figured it out.
Yeah.
I
No,
didn't take you
I'm
too
not. I'm
long.
not even going to give a hint. Well, I did Google it while you were talking. Yeah, female, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. A few world records there. Yeah,
yeah,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah. No, it's
I think at this point people are probably quite suspicious of almost, sadly, um, any Kenyan that has a world record, which is a shame because this leads me to another good question. I think I know the answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you believe David Rudisha was clean?
I do think he was clean.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so do I. I do as well.
I think he was clean because he grew up in that environment when he was taught morality, right? Um, Brother Calm, one of his uh, systems it was rooted on education, patience, and values, right? And not shortcuts. So he didn't charge any of his athletes. Um, he didn't take any winnings. That's something that I follow here and something that I learned from some of my mentors as well, right? Elite athletes, professional athletes, you shouldn't charge. I don't think so. And you shouldn't, make money from their winnings because then that creates the wrong environment. It creates the wrong reason to train at that level. He believed that money and bad people are the motivator for drugs, right? And he taught that early, like the morality, humbleness, staying grounded. So I don't know if you remember, David Rudisha would train with, some of his former, some of the high school athletes, right? Even though he was an Olympic level athlete, he was still coming back and training. And that's Rudisha did that for a reason, right? He did that because he wanted him to remind him like where he came from. Don't fall into, you know, the pockets of these mafias and these people that are out there to take advantage of you, right? And this is something that I follow as well. Sorry. Uh, if you treat athletes as people, that they have a career after running, then they're more likely to enjoy the sport and not be motivated to do all these things. And that's anytime an athlete comes up to, anytime I have an athlete that is coming from a country like Ethiopia and Kenya, or even Europe as well, there's athletes in Kenya, I'm sorry, in India. India is one of the highest positive doping cases, right? Anytime an athlete comes from these regions, the first thing I do is I pull them aside and have a one-on-one conversation. But I don't do it in the first month of training because I want them to trust me as a coach. I want them to get to know me a little bit better, to know that I'm not going to tell anyone about them or mention any names. And once I get, a little bit more trust, I have that serious conversation with them. And I ask, you can be honest with me. What happened in the past happened in the past. But did you do drugs? Right? And I'm like, I'm not going to tell anyone. It's just between me and you. And so far, I've been fortunate enough that the athletes that I've coached, none of them are done performance enhancing drugs at any point. But I think they're also weren't the fastest athletes in the world, right? Some some of these guys are running, 209, 207, 214, some of the ladies have run 800s and like close to the 2 minute mark. But they're not the fastest in the world. I think we see that more at the highest level, a lot more corruption there. So they've been lucky. And I'm going to be careful with that word lucky. I think they've avoided it. And I think especially the Kenyan athletes, they purposely avoided it. They ran away from it. They their careers almost ended, right? It's one of the sad stories that I've heard. It's, when one athlete being pushed away from running, not wanting to train anymore because she felt like everyone was against her. The federation was against her. Athletics Kenya, anti-doping, those mafias were against her, and they were trying to silence her, and she was worried, and then she got out of the country, and I've heard this multiple times, right? And I think that's one of the problems. And I think with Brother Combs Group, you have that isolated haven, right? Like it's a beautiful place to go to, and there's not many places like that in Kenya, but they do exist, right? Not just with Brother Colm. If we're talking about Ethiopia, there's Delay Hagels with Nedbank running. He's one of the coaches that I work with. Um, there's Jacob Longa. He's clean. He's a great coach. He was a former Kenyan Defense Force member. So I think when you're with the military, you live in more, you live in more morals. You're taught a little bit more of that kind of stuff. Charles Wamemi, he's former military as well. Bernard Uma, he's a great coach, one of the better ones. So I tell people listening to this podcast, look into these coaches as well for the good reasons, right? I think we need to illustrate that there are good coaches out there, but there's also some really, really bad ones.
Leads me to ask about a very well-known Italian coach, Renato Canova. I really hope. I'll be honest. I've always looked up to him as being one of the best coaches in the world. So I'm always hoping for no news here. But please tell me anything that you feel like sharing, if there's anything at all.
Renato Canova, I think a lot of people around the world have learned from him. From my end, I haven't heard anything from my end, but that doesn't mean that anything doesn't exist. And I'm going to be careful with that. I don't know, personally. Um, I will say, him and Brother Colm, they're in the same age group of coaches. They've been around, for a very, very long time before all this stuff. They've kind of avoided all of this early on. So there's a chance that, a lot of his athletes are clean. What I would say is, to the listeners here, if you really want to find out, right, look into the following things. Is he taking prize money from his athletes? How much is he taking? Has he ever been, is he very protective of his athletes? Does he go around and only want you to train in certain areas? Is he, there's a certain type of attitude that comes with that. And you can kind of figure that out. Um, you know, and what's his training like? What's his morality like? Does he is he all about winning, or is he all about long-term development? I think long-term development is the best culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
The short-term development is you prioritize the prize money, you recruit aggressively, you get a lot of people into your club, and then the cyclists come in and out. The athletes come in and out. That's usually the environment for dope, right? And then the environment that's not doesn't have that much doping is the athletes develop over 5 to 10 years. And that's what we saw with David Rudisha, right? They emphasize education and they have internal accountability. Um, and they protect athletes, but they protect them from the agents who push risk. They'll let them know which agents are the ones to avoid, who not to talk to, etc. So I can't say anything about Ronaldo, but I think you can talk to some of his people there and probably find out very quickly whether or not he's involved in any of this stuff. But I will say though, there's a lot, he's given to the sport of running, and you know, and I think the Western world has taken that and applied it to the Western world, and the rest of the world has applied it to their training, which may or may not work. That's a whole conversation about, we're not sleeping as much as they are, right? So I don't know if we can apply everything that he's done in 200 kilometers, 300 kilometers per week, and like all those, the base before the speed and all those periodization cycles, etc. But that's a whole nother conversation, I think, for another
Yeah.
talk.
I'll note that down to maybe talk about that another time because that would be good to chat to you about. Look, I've never heard anything suspicious about Canova, to be honest. I've actually spoken with him several times at length. I don't think he's protective at all about his athletes and where they train. He actually has a group and he sort of welcomes them to drop in and out and doesn't really seem to be too phased. Um, I don't know how he's incentivized. That's a good question. You asked the question is, does he take prize money? I'm not sure. Possibly. I actually have never really been
So
clear as to how he earns his money. I've heard different things, but then I've heard things that contradict other things. So I've heard he gets paid by like Qatar Athletics and then also by Nike, I think. But then I heard that both of those two things don't happen anymore. So I'm not sure. I don't know if you know anything. Mm.
yeah, I don't, but I was gonna say, I will clarify, right, that taking prize money from athletes isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. I personally would avoid it. A lot of great coaches will avoid it, right? But it's not against the rules. You can take winnings from athletes, but how much are they taking, right? If you're taking 80% of your athletes' winnings, or even more than 50%, that's criminal, right? I think
Mm.
so. That's the kind of question you want to look into. It's not whether he's taking prize money from his athlete. It's how much is he taking?
Yeah, good
And if that
question.
number's on the lower end, he's probably one of the good guys.
Yeah. Probably one of the most commonly asked questions that I get you know, along these lines in this topic is you mentioned that you can buy drugs at retail, basically. Um, I did experience one occasion in Kenya where another runner who I won't name, tried to buy EPO from a store, and it wasn't straightforward, but he could get it pretty easily after answering some questions. What more do you know about this topic? There's obviously a few drugs that we can talk about here. There's EPO, there's nandrolone, although I'm not sure how common that is in Kenya. That's common in the US. And then there's of course other things like I don't know how common testosterone is to take in Kenya, but anything more about I actually don't know. There's probably a few more drugs that I'm not even
Yeah.
familiar with. Yeah.
And Matt, this is a good thing that you don't know, right? It means you're clean,
Yeah. Oh, I'm definitely clean, yeah.
right? And yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. Otherwise, you're probably running like 201. So
Do
no,
you
I'm
reckon it
kidding.
helps? I don't know if it helps that much. Canova once told me.
No,
He actually said it doesn't help as
yeah,
much as most people realize.
yeah. No, I was gonna say, like, I don't think, I think people overemphasize on. Oh, there a lot of people will say, hey, the drugs are something that's gonna get you there. I was like, no, it's not gonna get you there. You'll probably run into a lot of health conditions, right? I'm not an expert on this, and it's one of the good things is that I don't know about the type of drugs either, because I never, you know, eh, no one's ever in my club. Actually, you know what? There was one guy in my club a long time ago. The funny part was he wasn't African and he wasn't that fat. And a friend of mine showed me a screenshot, and he was like, "Is your athlete doing drugs?" And I was like, "What the hell?" Right? And so when I looked at it and I asked him about it, And he was like, yeah. He's like, I bought it. I was like, well, first of all, where'd you even get this? Second of all, why are you doing this? And third of all, you need to stop this right away.
Yeah.
And then he's like, no, I want to keep taking it. And I was like, all right, well, I can't have you on the team. Sorry. Right. So I just cut him off from the team. I was like, I don't want anything to do with you. So there was that one case. And it was honestly just kind of hilarious because it wasn't even like he was that good. He was running like 18 minutes, I think, for a 5K. But it was just like totally unexpected. And it was the first time ever that, someone's ever said anything about drugs. But yeah, I don't know too much about the type of drugs. I know there's like blockers that people use, and I think that's where a lot of people get caught. And I know that there's testosterone, CPO, and stuff like that. But I don't know exactly where you can get these things. But what I have heard is, you know, you can get this stuff on the street. Apparently, like you can get them in the pharmacy, but at the street, they're hanging around, right? It's the same way you can find weed here. If you know the buyers, it's a one text away, and they'll give it to you, and they might give you the first one for free,
I
right?
thought it's retail in Canada, weed.
Yeah, sorry. I guess it wasn't legal for the longest time. It was just
Oh
legal for the
yeah,
last
it's
like
recent.
decade.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Yeah,
quite recent.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But like let's compare it to like cocaine or something like that, right?
Yeah.
If you are into that, like there are ways to get it, right? I think Sebastian Coe, said the best way he explained this was, winning the fight to achieve drug-free sport is very unlikely due to the risk and rewards. For a street kid, you get caught and you lose nothing. And he's right about that, right? Like if you're a kid that's running, you know, a 15-minute 5K as a Kenyan athlete, the chances if you're in the wrong program with the wrong coach, the chances of you doing drugs and finding drugs is a lot higher, right? Because you're like, whatever, let's just try it out. That's their mentality. And they don't really know a lot about this stuff because they're not that educated, right? Because they're focusing on their career and they're going to be running, and maybe their English isn't the best, right? And some of the other athletes that are a little bit more educated and know which groups to stay away from kind of avoid all this to begin with. But yeah, I mean, we look at India, that's one of the highest positive test rates. Russia was state sponsored, but Kenya is interesting because Kenya and Ethiopia, I mean, well, specifically Kenya, was born out of survival, right? It wasn't state sponsored. It was the most convenient way to get out of athletics, which I find is interesting. So I do think the problem is solvable. I think it just needs people need to like people like me that have talked to a lot of these athletes. They need to step up and talk and get the story out there. We also need evidence to take down some of these bigger managers.
Yeah, because when I watched, did you watch Jake Barraclough's video about the doping about a week and a half ago? Ran to Japan on YouTube. Okay.
I haven't seen it yet, but I will
So
check it
that
out later.
that actually sparked our podcast that you commented on.
Yeah.
Because Jake, who is a 214 British runner who's living in Japan, very popular YouTube channel, grown very quickly, he basically did a live stream of him talking for an hour about how Kenyans are ruining the sport. And because I've been to Kenya so many times and I've spoken to a lot of people, I've really learned, at least my view has been shaped to be, it's actually not, it's actually almost 100% of the time, it's not the Kenyans that are actually maliciously doing it. Like they're doing it, but there's all these drivers that you've brought up, right? There's all this, there's tribalism,
Yeah.
there's manipulation, there's in some cases there's even sexual harassment that's sort of linked. But yeah, people don't fully realize what it's like until you're there, and you're in the situation where, many, as you would know, having spoken to a lot of athletes, a lot of Kenyans come out of high school, they don't have the money to buy a phone, so they don't even know anything about the band list or anything like that. They're clueless, right? And yeah, someone from the West could say, oh, it's your responsibility. But when they're just trying to run fast, they don't know. They don't have a computer. They don't have a phone. Now, I'm aware some people listening are probably like, oh, that's nonsense. They should know this stuff. It should be everywhere. But it's not so straightforward like that. I don't know if you have any thoughts off the back of that, but I got that feeling from speaking to, because a lot of the pro athletes there that I spoke to in person, I just can tell by talking to them at length that they don't want to cheat. They actually want to just race. It's tricky.
Yeah. 100% agree with you. I think, what we see, with the rest of the world and the Western world is we only see the results. We see those championship wins. We don't see the work that happens behind the scenes, right? And we don't see all these dirty players that are involved. And so when we see someone like Ruth Chetnicek, test positive, we're like, oh yeah, the Kenyans are dirty. And I'm like, we know there's a lot of drugs in Kenya, right? But we can't blame the athletes all the time as a whole, right? If a certain athlete does a drug, yes, they are guilty. Right? There's no coming back from that. Maybe there's a place for them in not in running, like maybe not for competing, but maybe there's a place for them in preventing this from happening, maybe, right? But they are to blame. But I think the biggest blame is going to be all those dirty players involved. And man, you'd be surprised how many conversations I've had with people that have no idea, right? I'm on Instagram and the comments I see on some of these posts are like, the Kenyans are dirty. They're ruining the sport. And I don't think they want to ruin the sport. I don't
No,
think
I agree with you
they
100%.
want to go involved in this. It's just the situation that they're put into, right? And let's not forget that it's not just Kenya. It's Ethiopia. It's India. India, it's more widespread testing. It's
I
more
know.
doping. They're just doing it across every sport,
Yeah.
right? So
And
like
they don't have
Kenya
the
is just
natural they don't have the same natural talent because you don't see any Indian athletes at the top. They just don't have that natural talent there. So,
yeah.
yeah.
And the talent thing I think is a whole other conversation we can have on like what separates the athletes and talent and physiology and mentality and a few things that I've learned. But yeah, I don't. It's unfair, because of all the stories that I've heard, and as someone that's been in, I've talked to all these athletes. It honestly breaks my heart when I hear someone say this, because Kenyan and Ethiopians are some of the most humblest people you'll ever meet.
They really
Right?
are, yeah.
They'll come and train with us, and they're extremely consistent. They'll never ask you for anything, right? And sometimes I'll support them in some way, or I'll find one of our athletes, one of our other Western athletes will support them in some way. But they're super humble. They don't want to do anything. They don't want to cheat. That's for the last thing they're thinking about. They just want to compete. One of the challenges they have is in Kenya. Sorry, in Canada. I'll talk about Canada because that's where our athletes are. Is surviving because they don't have a lot of them don't have the education and they come here and have to find a job, right? And most of the time they're working as an Uber driver, um, or they're working as a factory or a security guard, and that's a lot of man hours. It's a lot of time on your feet. And then they come to practice, they're exhausted. I can see it, right? Like I can see that their body is not responding to training like it did last week when they were recovered. So you're coming off of an 8 to 12 hour shift, and you're training. At a certain point, that motivation drops because you're not competing at the same level you used to when you're in Kenya and Ethiopia. And then you come here and it's like everyone's talking crap, right? You know, I get these comments all the time. It's like you have a lot of Kenyan athletes. And I know behind the scenes people are talking about that, right? But the truth of the reality is they are more hardworking than a lot of born citizens that I've met in Canada. And probably more than me, to be honest. Um, and I have the utmost respect for the athletes that I coach. Some of them have stopped running, and some of them are still competing, right? But I think they've made it so far. Some of these stories are horrifying, but some of the stories are good too. Are very good stories. Some of them have been lucky enough to avoid all this. So I'm just hope this conversation it opens that light into people that are looking at it from a negative point of view. And yes, you should look at it from that way. But you should also look at it from a positive point of view.
I think that's a great way to round up this conversation at least. I've written down here that I'd love to speak to you at some point more about Canova's method and maybe how to apply that to recreational runners because a lot of my training is shaped around Canova's ideas, but I have almost dialed that way down to my own level because I'm not, like you said, I don't sleep 10
Yeah,
hours a day. I have
yeah,
commitments and other things, and also the talent one in India is interesting too to speak about. But I try to keep these pods to around an hour, mostly to link with people's running durations. So I really appreciate your time. Where can people, contact you? Or you said you've got Instagram, but you might want to share where you post things publicly about your updates.
yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Our club is based in Toronto, Canada, but we have athletes from Ethiopia, Kenya that are training there. We also have athletes in the States, in their NCAA, and also other countries in Europe. And you can find us in Toronto, Canada, usually at one of the most famous loops, High Park Loop or Mount Pleasant Loop or King's College Circle at U of T. or on the lakeshore. Our Instagram is northern.endurance. And our website is northernerenduranceproject.com.
Awesome.
And if anyone has any questions about, training specifically, if you're listening to this and you're an African athlete that's looking to assimilate into a group, in a smooth way, you know, I think we're the perfect group for that. So shoot us a message and we're more than willing to help. And anyone else that's, we're looking to compete at a more higher level, we do have beginner athletes, but we also have, elite athletes, and we have certain qualifications you can see in our website. But if you feel you fit into that category, shoot us a message as well.
Coach Selva Yoga, really appreciate your time and looking forward to staying connected and speaking about all things running in the future.
All right, thanks a lot, Matt, for this conversation. I hope it enlightens a lot of viewers and hopefully opens the world to the truth about Kenya and athletics.